Welcome to the March 14th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today we're going to talk about Canada's new Prime Minister. Mark Carney was sworn in today. He announced his cabinet, and my guest for today, Mark Zacarias, who's Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada, participated in a call with the new PM, so he'll have maybe a few insights for us. Welcome to the interview, Mark.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into the new PM, I got an email today from the Sustainable Business Council, it's an American organization, and it has a fact book. And one of the facts really caught my eye. It's U.S. energy overview and average electricity rates by country. And we'll put it up here in a moment. But I wanted to talk to you about it because it shows that Canada has the second lowest industrial electricity prices and the second lowest residential electricity prices in the world. And you and I agree that clean, low cost, reliable electricity is really the basis for national economies in the 21st century. What a competitive advantage we have. It's amazing. And I just wanted to get your response to that.
We've been saying that for years Canada has not only some of the lowest cost electricity in the G7 and G20, as you note, but we have the ability to actually scale up generation, build inner ties, and the opportunity for more clean energy across Canada. Now, whether that is baseline hydro, whether it's wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear, it could be a range of sources. But we're just so well prepared. There was a study, it's a couple years old now, came out, I think, 2021, that showed that of all the nations in the world, Canada was number two behind Russia in terms of powering its entire grid with renewable energy. So, yeah, huge opportunity.
Yeah, I would agree. And one of the things that economists keep telling us is that as the global economy electrifies, because that's the direction we're going to electrify transportation with electric vehicles and buildings with heat pumps and industrial processes with plasma arc technology, whatever it is. We're going to have to expand our grids by 2 to 3 times. We've already seen, you and I both live in British Columbia, and we've seen BC Hydro come out with a plan to add wind and solar to the hydro so that the hydro acts like a battery to the intermittent renewables. And given the amount of hydro we have in this country, that seems like a brilliant way to go forward in maintaining our advantages on the electricity sector.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the hydro acts as a battery, so we can actually buy power. When the rates are near zero or even negative from the Southwest US right now, particularly in months like April or May when there's overproduction. And, all that power that we can buy here gets stored in our BC reservoirs for when we need it. So, the opportunities for arbitrage between us and our neighbors and, into the US is absolutely huge. And it's not just hydro. If you look at Ontario, their equivalent to hydro is actually nuclear on base load. So New Brunswick a little bit in the same boat here. So basically, almost all provinces have this opportunity to kind of really use their electricity not only to grow their own industries, make their industries more competitive, make their jurisdictions more attractive for foreign direct investment, but also to make money selling power where it's needed.
Right. And this will be the last question, then we'll get into talking about Prime Minister Carney. There's a big push on now, which there hasn't been for decades, to have more east-west trade in electricity because of the Donald Trump, the U.S. president, putting tariffs on all of our exports going into the U.S. And so there's a big push to do more internal trade. That brings up the prospect of electricity, and that means, I mean, Alberta and Saskatchewan have the best wind and solar resources in the country. So if we can tie those together with the hydro provinces of BC and Manitoba, that's a powerhouse.
Oh, absolutely. And, no objection to any of that. In fact, it was back in 2017, if you recall, it was the RECSI program. I think it was Regional Electricity Connection Initiative, where the federal government was looking at how do we actually work with provinces to connect. And, it was the right idea, maybe at the wrong time. But now, given trades and tariffs and kind of where the global economy is going and what we know about electricity we didn't know 6 years ago, it seems to be the right idea to do it now.
Agreed. And that's a good segue into the new prime minister, and we're going to likely have an election here called probably in the next week or two. It won't be long now, and so this is timely to talk about the role of electricity going forward, and the federal government. And so what did anything you can share with us from your conversation with the prime minister this morning?
Just that it looks like the prime minister will build on a lot of the efforts that the federal government has been working on over the last decade. I think if you look at the ministers' portfolios, Minister Wilkinson staying put, Minister Guilbeault still being very prominent in cabinet, and in fact, having a kind of role where he now has Parks Canada, heritage, and culture together. So I think he'll be a strong voice around the cabinet table. I think you noted at the beginning of the podcast was that Anita Anand kind of moving into a more senior role. Minister Champagne kind of moving into Minister of Finance. Like these are kind of known voices around the cabinet table that are very bought into the clean economy and kind of a lot of the agenda around climate and the energy transition. So I think what you will see is you'll see a government that is going to start talking differently about kind of the clean economy and climate, in terms of that these are the solutions to a lot of things, productivity challenges, growing our economy, making our economy more competitive, finding different destination markets for Canadian low carbon goods and services. So I think what you're going to see here is that they're going to build on a lot of the existing work and just kind of start exploring some of the new dimensions. And we'll talk about that probably your next question.
Well, actually, my next question is about Jonathan Wilkinson. Now, that because he has the energy portfolio, he's the minister that we talk about the most. And we did a story earlier in the week about some comments he made on the weekend in a Globe and Mail piece by Adam Radwanski. And our episode was about how he said that why are we getting all excited about oil pipelines? And the case for a new oil pipeline is the economic case is tenuous at best. And I think the fact that the prime minister gave him that portfolio again suggests maybe the prime minister is thinking along the same lines.
Well, after reading that, and Minister Wilkinson, he brings up a lot of very good points, and that, we are in a crisis that needs to be addressed in the next couple of years through this Trump administration. And building a pipeline, as we've seen with TMX, it can take decades to get through approval processes. A world now where Indigenous consent is required for large linear major projects, in a world where capital markets really aren't necessarily into the risk necessary. So it may be that if we wanted an east-west oil pipeline, that the federal government would have to step in again, like they did with TMX, and purchase the project. And also, too, is if you look at demand forecasts over the coming decade or two, when this pipeline would be operational, it's not clear that there's going to be customers for the product. And I think that was a key point in some of the minister statements.
I would agree. And we just did an episode again earlier in the week, an episode where we talked about Trans Mountain expansion and the financial scenarios that Trans Mountain has filed with Canadian Energy Regulator, and all of them show that the TMX will be profitable. The problem is the utilization factor, 96%. That means that the pipe is full all the time, which means it has customers, right? And we said, what about the energy transition? What about peak oil demand in 2030 and then declined sometime in the 2030s? That means that there might not be customers and it might not be full and it might not make money anymore. And those are risk factors that should be taken into account for TMX, but certainly before Canada embarks on a new pipeline.
Absolutely. And who knows what the future of oil is going to look like. And one of the benefits of the oil sands is that you've got a product there that can be used in non-combustible purposes. You can make asphalt from it, you can make graphite, you can make a whole bunch of different products. So we don't really know kind of what the future of that resource is going to be. But as you know, it is expensive to get out of the ground. It is fairly high carbon. And even with OPEC Plus, with all of their production cuts over the last couple of years, oil just barely squeaks over $70 a barrel at today's prices. And it's been that way for the last couple of years now. So it seems to be there's a lot of effort to keep the oil price up through a lot of production cuts worldwide. And now you've got the US looking at potentially more oil exploration and development, pushing more product into the market. So I'm not sure that we're going to see a sustained price increase over the years. And in fact, we may see a slow decrease.
Let's talk about some of the climate and clean economy policies that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, were a hallmark of his roughly 10 years as head of the government. Can you just give us an overview from your point of view what those policies were?
Well, they're kind of different buckets, right? There was your traditional top-down command and control policies, around kind of regulating industrial or consumer behavior. So, those would be, just give you examples, the clean electricity regulations, methane regulations, the oil and gas emissions cap, the EV afford sales mandate, right? So those types of regulations, that'd be kind of the first sort of suite. The second piece of policies in the Trudeau government was really the incentives. And those would be either direct incentives to a particular proponent to switch out a technology to be less emitting. If you remember, steel and cement got quite a bit of funding to actually kind of help transition their processes through the Strategic Innovation Fund and Net Zero Accelerator. And there was around almost $10 billion in those funds. Aligned in that sort of set of policies too, where things like the investment tax credits, there's a few that have yet to be finalized, but for the most part, those investment tax credits that were announced a couple of years ago are slowly getting over the line. And I would say the third bucket is kind of consumer incentives. So these were grants, incentives, and rebates for home retrofits and EVs and smart thermostats and heat pumps and things like that. So those are kind of the bucket of policies that I would say, most of the ones that people are familiar with from the Trudeau government. And of course, layered on top of that, carbon pricing and the carbon tax.
Right, and the Prime Minister Carney has committed to ending the consumer tax, carbon tax. And we should point out, especially for non-Canadian viewers, that Canada's had a carbon tax, but there are actually two parts to it. There's the consumer tax, and then there's the industrial emitters tax, and both of them are, for the most part, administered by the provincial government. So the industrial emitters tax will remain, carbon tax. Um, one of the criticisms of the Trudeau government, Mark, that I found really interesting, has always been how poorly they sold all of these policies. And this is one of the reasons why I thought Wilkinson might not make it into the energy portfolio again, is because, I mean, I've interviewed him a number of times. He's been on our Energy Talks podcast, and he's a smart guy. He comes out of the hydrogen economy in BC, so he gets clean energy. I wouldn't call him a great salesman. And I don't, the carbon tax wasn't sold very well, but Canadians didn't understand it really well. A lot of these other climate policies, energy policies arguably weren't sold all that great. And it seems like we need somebody who can explain this to Canadians. I'm not sure he's the guy.
Well, I think a lot of that is going to be left to the Prime Minister himself. Mark Carney has a background in climate finance, and knows this file as good as anybody around the cabinet table.
Yeah.
So, and I think you're right, when the consumer carbon tax was put in place in 2019, it really wasn't visible to people. They saw that they paid it, they didn't see that they were getting rebated for it. And, it took several years before you actually got a check with your carbon rebate, back into your hands. You understood that, hey, wait a minute, 80% of Canadian households are getting back more than they're paying. And yet, that was all dwarfed by three words, axe the tax. And it's just, sometimes you have an uphill battle that you're just, aren't unable to win. I think going forward, though, is we will see from this new government very much kind of weaving climate, the economy, and energy into the same common narrative, where climate actually becomes the response to US trade, wars, sanctions, tariffs, and things like that. And I think what you're going to see is climate being kind of used as here's the way that Canada is going to differentiate its economy, set its economy on a prosperous future path. look at our export markets that aren't in the US, so basically in Asia and the EU, realizing that, almost all of our trading partners outside of the US are still committed to some net zero trajectory. And then basically aligning kind of our export development strategy to provide goods into these markets. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that happening. I also think you're going to see from this government a bit more of the instead of individual climate policies that appear to many Canadians and businesses potentially to be punitive, you're going to see a move to a nation building focus. It really is going to be we are going to build interties. It's going to be like the railroads and the last spike. This is going to connect our country. It's going to build solidarity. It's going to make energy cheaper. It's going to make life more affordable. It's going to bolster FDI, bring it into the country, and all of that's going to be good. So I think that's going to be one of them. And then I think too, you'll see an effort from this government to really try and connect the EV and battery supply chains. That affects all Canadians from critical minerals, from coast to coast to coast. Provides an opportunity to actually move the minerals, process them here, use them in battery assembly, manufacture the autos here, recycle the autos here at end of life, but also for the government is build the demand side around, helping Canadians actually get into autos whose batteries and the chassis are actually manufactured in Canada. So huge opportunities there.
Um, we've been involved in some conversations with climate groups about how to communicate the energy transition and clean energy. And we see it as here at Energy Media as two sides of a coin. So there's the climate change, which is the problem, with the rising emissions and rising global temperatures. And then the solution, as it were, is on the clean energy side. And we argue that the climate issue, people understand climate change, and there's a political constituency that's been created that supports climate policies like carbon tax and so on. But we focus on the building of the clean energy economy, whether that's the power sector, whether it's clean industries, whatever it is. That's what we do here at Energy Media. And I would argue that building a clean energy economy, the political constituency still has not been created across the country for that. Now, with an organization named Clean Energy Canada, I suspect you have an opinion on that.
It, absolutely. So we are very much of the mind that to get people to invest in climate and the clean economy is they have to invest in the climate and clean economy. And what that means is that actually means getting everyday Canadians in touch that they tangibly interact with clean technologies. Whether that's as something as simple as a smart thermostat, or an EV or a heat pump, or getting people kind of into or interested in rooftop solar and battery storage, like making climate action in the clean economy tangible to everyday people, where they actually put their own money towards these solutions, that brings you into it. And what you get there is you get a network effect. So as somebody on your street kind of buys a F-150 Lightning EV truck, it's people talk about it, right? So you actually start kind of, it's the ambassador model of this. So that's kind of the first part in all this. The second part is we need to make sure that, and again, this comes back to connecting supply chains and critical minerals and producing renewable energy, is that, a rising tide lifts all boats in Canada. Communities, Indigenous, non-Indigenous communities, all have the opportunity to actually benefit from the transition. And this is where I think the new government can really move the needle on with some sort of thoughtful policies.
One of the things that we've seen in other countries, we see it in the EU, we see it in China, we see it in some of the Asian economies that are really engaged in the energy transition, like Malaysia and Indonesia and Brazil would be another example. But it's the use of clean energy industrial policy, industrial strategy and policy. And China is my best example of this because China, when it decided to build an EV industry 15 years ago, it didn't just incentivize the supply side or the demand side, it did both at the same time. And I've thought for a long time that Canada needs that kind of a clean economy strategy to say, we're going to do this sector, like let's say critical minerals. It's not just the mining of the critical minerals. You then have to take those minerals and make them into metals. You smelt them or process them into metals. Then you take the metals and you make them into battery cells. And then you take the battery cells and you make them into battery packs. And then the battery packs go into and that's your supply chain. And if we think of it like that, the opportunity around critical minerals is so much bigger than it is if you just think of it as let's open up some mines and get nickel and magnesium and cobalt and whatever, and then sell it to whoever is actually is also making batteries. And I think that strategic approach, China's done it well. The U.S. was trying to do it under Biden. The EU has done it with mixed results. But that strategic approach is what it's kind of been lacking, I think.
It, yeah, I would agree. I think, a couple of years ago when Canada started looking at landing these large kind of battery plants in Ontario and a lesser extent Quebec, and also some of the battery precursor materials processing, what was really needed at that time was an entire look and a coordinated strategy along the entire supply chain, which would look at the supply side, the demand side, making sure that you actually have EV incentives that drive people to buy cars that are manufactured in Canada. So I think there's a recognition now that supply chain needs to get built out. One of the things we want to see get done from the federal government as soon as possible, there is an investment tax credit that basically gives you an additional 15% if you do three things in the EV battery supply chain. So, right now, I think Honda is the only company that could potentially access that because they do quite a bit on the battery supply chain in Canada. But that would certainly entice other manufacturers to give Canada a very hard look. And again, we are, 4 years, maybe 8 years of Republican leadership, but eventually, we are going to be back trading with the US and we need to be able to kind of look at, what are the vehicles people are going to be driving 10 years from now, and they're going to be electric.
See, this is really interesting. We see Donald Trump being elected as president, and all of his policies to promote the oil and gas sector there. It's drill, baby, drill, Sarah Palin's old line, and his attempts to restrict the development of offshore wind, for example. And we just go, oh my God, it's going to be 8 years of a desert or 4 years of desert, for the clean energy economy. That's not true. The utilities are saying, look, we can do some gas, that's true, but we're going to have this huge expansion of the electricity system in the U.S., and the only way we can do this in a timely fashion is with wind and solar and batteries. So there is now a very strong economic case for clean energy industries that has nothing to do with policy. Policy will speed it up, and maybe policy could slow it down a little bit, but policy, the development of it, the commercialization of it, and the movement up the bell curve really now is independent of policy. And I think the U.S. is going to continue to develop a lot faster than people think.
Yeah, we would agree. If you look at the market fundamentals in the US around kind of renewable energy and things like that, I think there was some stats out this week showed that Texas has now surpassed California in both wind
Yeah.
and solar production, which was just astounding. We also did a bit of work last month. We published a report on it was British Columbia's electricity grid, but in it we looked at the 5 U.S. states with the largest share of renewables. That's wind and solar. And those 5 states had electricity prices that were on average 25% lower than the US average. And the delta is increasing. So as these states, most of which are red states, are adding wind and solar, the difference between their electricity price and the national electricity price keeps getting lower. So it is really interesting to watch what's going to happen down there. And the other piece too is, gasoline is still reasonably cheap in the US, but we're seeing all of these new battery facilities being kind of set up, that have been taking advantage of kind of the Biden, the IRA and whatnot. And they are really going to be producing the low cost, high quality batteries over the coming decade. And, people are still going to buy EVs.
See, that's another thing that's not well understood, and because it was assumed when Biden put on the 100% tariffs against Chinese electric vehicles last May, so just about a year ago, and then Canada followed in September with 100% tariffs, that basically the domestic manufacturers like GM and Ford and Stellantis would just kind of be fat and happy. And that's not been the case at all. And if you listen to like CEO Jim Farley at Ford or GM CEO Mary Barra, they get it. This is the future of the industry, and they are working really hard to get their costs down, their scale up, so they can be profitable. And you look at the GM; they brought out the Chevy Equinox last year as the EV, and it's like $35,000. I mean, that's less than the average price of an average American car. So they're not where the Chinese are by any stretch, but for the United States in that market, they've clearly said or sent the message that they're going to be competitive.
Yeah. And they have to, right? They are a global automaker. So, whatever they design and use in the US is going to be applicable to other markets in which they sell their products. And you're right. Yeah. GMs, they've got the Equinox, they've got the electric Blazer, and their sales numbers are very impressive, over the last 2 quarters. So, we are still seeing, even under a Trump presidency, we're seeing a lot of interest in these vehicles and we're seeing sales that are still increasing, even if the US sale point of sale incentive goes away.
And the key thing here is I think we should echo Jonathan Wilkinson. Everybody take a beat. Let's slow down. We have to push back, so we put on countervailing tariffs to counter the $30 billion so far, and then we'll see what happens in 21 days, and there'll be another 125 billion if Trump continues to escalate and or even keep them where they are. That's fine. We're going to have a trade war, and that's going to hurt, and it's good. We need to have a strategy to deal with that. And Carney has said very clearly, spend less, invest more. So he wants to build. We get that. But by the same token, the integration between the two economies, especially on the energy system, oil, gas, and electricity, I don't think it's going to change that much. And there are a lot of voices in Canada right now, as one of my friends called it, economic nationalists, who are absolutely, that's it. We can't forgive them what they've done. That's it. We're done with the Americans. I don't think we're done with the Americans. It's a good thing to diversify trade, and this is a moment in time. It's been coming since 1867, where we stop being hewers of wood and drawers of water, and we add value to our resources, and we go east and west, and we export to other countries other than the United States. This is an opportunity in time. But the Americans are still going to be a very large part of our trade and a part of our economy, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
No, absolutely. I mean, 4 years is just a blip in the grand scheme of things, particularly when you're looking at building an economy that's going to survive for the next couple of decades. So, and the other one too is the US, is still a massive exporter of pretty much everything. So they're going to be looking at their markets and what their markets wants in terms of the types of products and whether it's electrified or whether it has some carbon intensity threshold to it. But, that's going to drive what and how they produce as well.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Now, if we can just manage to not get annexed by over the next 4 years and become the 51st state, then all of the things we talked about will be relevant. And I don't think it'll happen, but I mean, Trump is threatening. Mark, this has been a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate your insights into where the new government is going to go. And like I said, we're going to have an election here fairly quickly, so we'll catch up with you after the election to see where you think that new government will go, whether it's liberal or CPC, conservative. And so thank you very much for this.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.